Today we're going to talk about exponents and properties of real numbers, including some of the properties of addition and multiplication. First of all, exponents are how we write out repeated multiplication. So a multiplied 3 times becomes a to the third. So -5 multiplied 4 times, how would we write that using exponents? -5 to the fourth. And 3x in parentheses raised to the fifth, what does that mean in terms of multiplication? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you actually calculate exponents, if you actually evaluate them and plug them into your calculator, if you have an even exponent, that means there are an even number of -5s being multiplied together, and all of those negatives would cancel out. If you had -5 in parentheses raised to the third, you would have an odd number of negatives. They would not cancel. Grab your calculators. Let's practice entering these in our calculator. You could do this by hand without a calculator if you wanted to. You could do 2 multiplied 5 times and just keep track of it in your head. Or we can use the calculator. If you are using a scientific calculator like the TI-30X2S, the ones that you've been using forever, the exponent button is diagonal up from the 7. So look at where your 7 is and then go diagonal to the left. You'll see a little button that looks like an upside down V. We call that a caret, or the exponent button. On the graphing calculator, it's directly above the division key. On some calculators, it looks like a button that says y to the x or x to the y. So to raise 2 to the fifth, we do 2, caret button, 5. I wrote a 2 instead of a 5. You should get 32. For the next one, the fraction, 2/3 to the fourth, there's 2 ways that we could do this. One way is parentheses 2/3, so 2 divided by 3, raise it to the fourth. The problem with this method is that it gives you a decimal. So you have to know how to change decimals back to fractions, which is a good skill to have. On the scientific calculators, the F to D feature is above your PRB button, so you do second PRB, and that'll change it back into a fraction. On the graphing calculators, you use your math button, which is directly below the alpha. Enter, enter. Math button, enter, enter, changes it into a fraction. And you get 16/81. The other way to do this, 2/3 to the fourth means 2/3 multiplied 4 times, which means you have the 2 multiplied 4 times on the top and the 3 multiplied 4 times on the bottom. So you could do 2 to the fourth in your calculator, which is 16, and then 3 to the fourth, which is 81. So if the fractions and the decimals kind of freak you out, do it that way. Take a moment and try the next 2 on your own. I also want you, after you do -3 to the fourth, I also want you to try -3 in parentheses raised to the fourth. So pause the video, try these 3 on your own, then play to check your work. -4 to the third, you should get -64, and that does make sense. If we have -4 3 times, there's an odd number of negatives. The negatives don't cancel, so we have -64. When we type in -3 to the fourth in the calculator, it tells us -81. But there's an even exponent, so what the heck is going on there? If we put the -3 in parentheses, then the calculator tells us +81. That's what I would consider to be the correct answer. So why did the calculator tell us the wrong answer on -3 to the fourth with no parentheses? Anybody know? Okay, the calculator is actually doing 3 to the fourth first, then it's sticking the negative on there. Basically, your calculator does not know what you are intending. Your calculator is trying really hard to do correct order of operations, so it's doing the exponent before it does the negative. So, warning, if you are trying to take a negative number raised to an exponent, always put that negative number in parentheses so that you are telling your calculator exactly what you want it to do. You do not have this screen in your notes, but that's okay because I feel like you all are pretty good at PEMDAS by now. The P in PEMDAS, parentheses, always do parentheses and other grouping symbols first. Next is E, exponents. Make sure you do the exponents next. M and D, multiplication and division. You do all multiplication and division from left to right. So if division happens in the problem first before the multiplication, you do division before multiplication. These two are interchangeable. Multiplication is not more important than division. Same thing with addition and subtraction. You do whichever one comes first, left to right. This might blow your mind a little bit. Subtraction doesn't actually exist. It's a myth. Your teachers have been feeding you a complete lie for years and years and years. If you are subtracting 5, what you're really doing is adding -5. But when you're in elementary school, little elementary school brains cannot comprehend negative numbers. Your brain just isn't developed enough to understand the concept of negatives. So they came up with this thing called subtraction. Let's subtract 5 from the pile. Let's take away 5 from the pile. So subtraction really is just the addition of negative numbers. That's why addition isn't more important than subtraction. They are the same thing. Division also doesn't really exist. It's the same as multiplication. Dividing by 2 is the same as splitting it into a half, multiplying by a half. So division and multiplication, one's not more important than the other. Do whichever one comes first, left to right. All right, I want you to take a minute. If you're watching the video, pause the video. I mean it, pause the video. Pause the video. Try example 3, 4, and 5 on your own using order of operations. We are going to talk about example 4 because of the fractions. So try 3, 4, and 5 on your own. Go. You should have paused the video by now. I mean it. Pause the video. I know you haven't paused yet. Pause the video. In the first problem, the brackets are a second set of parentheses. So you do the first set of parentheses farther inside, 5 times 3 to get 15. 2 to the third is 8. You've still got another set of grouping, another grouping symbol. So 15 plus 8 is 23. 7 minus 23, you should get -16. All right. Number 4, theoretically, we have learned about fractions, so we could find a common denominator between 6 and 4 and then add those fractions to get some fraction and then do 8/3 times that fraction. Or we could use our handy dandy calculator because that's just better, right? So I would start in the inside with 1/6 plus 1/4, and I would do 1 divided by 6 inside parentheses plus parentheses 1 divided by 4. I don't care that I have a decimal at this point. That is what's inside this set of parentheses. So there's some fraction in here. We now need to multiply 8/3 times that. So times, put 8 divided by 3 inside parentheses. You get the decimal 1.1 repeated. Change that to a fraction. Math, enter, enter. 10/9. You should get 10/9 as your answer for that problem. Number 5. Those straight bars mean absolute value, but they also work as a grouping symbol. So you must do all of the stuff inside the absolute value bars before you move on. So we have to start in the innermost group. 6 plus 5 is 11. Then 2 minus 11 is -9. What is the absolute value of -9? 9. So we have to do 17 minus 9, which is 8. Okay, how do you feel about order of operations? Good? You do have this slide in your notes. I wanted you to have the list of properties. This looks like a lot to memorize. It's really not that bad. You need to memorize the term commutative. Commutative refers to the order in which you do things. So 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2, they're both going to give you 5. That is the commutative property of addition. 5 times 10 or 10 times 5, they are both going to give you 50. That is the commutative property of multiplication. You don't need to memorize the property of addition part. That should be pretty obvious by looking at the problem. You need to memorize that commutative means switching the order. Associative means switching the groupings. So if you've got the first two grouped and then in the next step you have the second two grouped, that is the associative property of either addition or multiplication. Distributive, you guys know that property, right? So we're good on distributive. Identity, the identity property. Identity is 0 or 1. If you add the identity to something, it doesn't change the number. So, for example, if I take 5 and add 0 to it, we are still going to have 5. If I take 10 and multiply it by 1, we are still going to have 10. So if you multiply or add something and it doesn't change the value, that's the identity property. The inverse property is when you're trying to make something turn into the identity. So you're taking a number and adding the opposite of that number to get back to 0. You're making the number go away. So like 5 plus -5 gives you 0. If you take a number like 2 and multiply it by its reciprocal, it ends up taking you back to 1. That is the multiplicative inverse. Using that list of properties that you have, I would like you to try to figure out which property is being illustrated by each of these problems. So take a moment, pause the video, try A, B, C, and D on your own using that property list. Tried to start off with an easy one. What's A? Distributive property. If you see that parentheses have gone away, it's probably distributive property. The next one, we're multiplying by the reciprocal to make the identity appear. This gets screwed up with the identity property, but if you're getting the identity, it's because you did something with the inverse. So this is the multiplicative inverse. On your assignment, if all you write is inverse, that's good enough for me. On the test or the quiz, I'll give you a list of problems and I'll give you a list of possible properties and you'll be matching them. So you won't have to come up with them on your own. You'll have a list to choose from. C. In C, the order or the location of the parentheses has changed. That is the associative property. Technically, it's the associative property of addition. If you just write associative property, good enough. And D, we are adding 0. That would be the additive identity. If you just write identity, that would be fine. Okay. Book assignment starts on page 40. 6 through 12 evens, 34, 36, 42, and then 58 through 68 evens.